Okay, let's talk Greek culture. First thing to note is that Greek is basically anything that happens in this area of the Aegean Sea. It was a loose collection of city-states that shared similar cultural practices and similar languages, but there was nothing keeping them from invading or engaging in war with one another at any point in time. The Greeks were extremely competitive amongst one another. They were a great seafaring nation, had probably the best navy in the world at the time. Extremely formidable because they basically lived in and around the water their entire lives. It was just the competitive elements and the seafaring elements are just pieces of the culture that just permeated everything. Good example of that here. The competitive part, well, the word flask just basically describes this type of vessel, a spherical vessel with a flat bottom and a flat top. These would have been used to export wine and olive oil, the two primary exports of the Aegean cultures. This makes them stackable. The flat bottom and flat top means you can sit them on top of each other, and the spherical shape is really good at distributing weight. So they would have been a lot more sturdy. And then this octopus, yeah, it says it right there. The octopus on it um, could have been a totem for good luck, but more to the point, it was probably branding. You probably had someone who was just selling octopus brand olive oil or wine or whatever. The octopus painted on the vessel also could have served as a competitive advantage. You know, you're selling flasks with these nice octopus on them, and maybe somebody else isn't. So that gives you a leg up on your competition. Beyond that, you can assume that whenever the product was gone, the olive oil was all used up, a nice vessel like this might have been repurposed and used for something else around the house. So it's sort of like advertising as well. Like that's the competition part. So seafaring, competitive, etc. Now, the flask is the name of this particular vessel. The crater is the name of this particular type of vessel. There um, well over a dozen different types of vessels just based on their shape, but I'm just going to bring attention to these two, the flask and the crater. Now, this is a very large, oh no, a large vessel. It's about 3.5 feet tall, and it would have been used to hold wine, but for a very different purpose than a flask would. Flasks were made for transporting and storing. This was basically like a headstone. It's made of two parts primarily. Like this is one large empty vessel with a base that attaches to it here. Now, if you could detach these things, then this part has a teeny tiny little hole right here in the middle. And through that hole, the wine would drip down on top of the body that was buried beneath it. That's why it was placed at the head, because it was almost like you're paying homage by giving the wine specifically to your lost loved one. But it was a way to continue to establish a relationship with your ancestors, with your father, grandfather, great grandfather, on and on through the generations, because you would have these graveyards, and if somebody noticed, they were walking by and they noticed that your grandfather's crater had gone dry of wine, then that's an embarrassment for you as a family. It means that you don't respect your elders. It means that you're not taking your lineage seriously. It was a big strike against you, and a 3.5 foot vessel that would hold a lot of wine. But this idea of continuously establishing relationships with your ancestors, like really respecting your own lineage is like viewed as being part of a bloodline that's much bigger than you are is something. It's a recurring theme. When we move on to Roman culture, it becomes really pervasive there. If you look really closely, see the designs here on the crater? That actually depicts a funerary procession as it goes through the streets. It's like that's what you're seeing there. So if you didn't know right off the top of your head that the crater was a funerary vessel, then you might be given some context clues here. In fact, that's supposed to be the dead body right there. All right, moving on. Very simply, a citadel, this word right here, is just a fortified city. This reinforces that whole idea that the Greek city-states were very competitive, and there's nothing keeping one city-state from invading another city-state other than maybe a standing army, or in this particular case, a giant wall. So if you had something that you really wanted to keep for yourself, then you would put a wall around it. That's what a citadel was. It's just a fortified city. Now this particular one has a primary entrance right here, and we'll see that next. The Lion's Gate. Can you see that? That right there. Now, not only is this a great example of a post and lintel structure, and also very clearly megalithic. These are just big rocks stacked on top of each other. But this was the primary entrance of that particular citadel. Now, you're going to have to know the difference between Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian architecture, and that probably sounds really intimidating, but it's a very simple process. Let's just zoom in right here. The only part that you really have to pay attention to know the difference is the capital of the column, and that's this part right here. It's the part that sits right on top of the column, right here. Now, this is a Doric column. You see, Doric columns are the most simplistic form, and they're also the biggest and sturdiest. They talk about this in the Parthenon video below, but Doric is like the Papa Bear column. It's very sturdy, it's load-bearing, it's intended to really support the structure, but it's not all that decorative. The column here is very simple. It's got these slope sides. It's just not supposed to be pretty. It's very, very functional. Over here, moving on, this is the Ionic column right here, Ionic. The columns here have these are called volutes or scrolls. That's a very simple indicator. Anytime you see those scrolls and nothing else, then what you're looking at is Ionic column. Now, when we move on to this next one, the Corinthian column, right there from Corinth, you do see those volutes, but you also see what are called acanthus leaves. These really decorative, highly detailed, stylized leaves that seem to be growing out of the top of the column. That's Corinthian. Now, notice, if the Doric column is the Papa Bear column, then this is the Mama Bear column, Ionic, and the Baby Bear is definitely the Corinthian. It's like the Corinthian column is a fraction of the size of the Doric column, and the Ionic column is somewhere in the middle. And you can tell by the time they developed the Corinthian order, by the time they got this far, they really weren't relying on this particular column to support a whole lot of weight. That was really the job of a Doric column. Sometimes these were mixed in structures, but typically you would find one particular order of column because for stylistic reasons that a Doric column was the first phase of architecture, and then it kind of fell out of fashion. Then Ionic became popular, and then by the time you get to the Corinthian columns, they're using load-bearing walls and other things like that to support the structures. A lot of times the Corinthian columns were really just for decoration. You should still see each of these. Doric columns are really common in if you have a really old or what is trying to appear to be really old, like plantation style home, then you might see a Doric column. Um, Churches and courthouses use a lot of Ionic and Corinthian columns, especially really nice ones. There's some great examples of Corinthian and Ionic columns. Even downtown Winston-Salem here. It's not a big city, but they do have some examples of these. So just remember, the capital is the part that sits on top of the column, and you can look at the capital to tell which order it is. Doric, very simple. Ionic, slightly more decorative, and Corinthian is just very decorative. Now, I'm not going to take too much time on this. The Acropolis and the Parthenon are both discussed at length in the video at the bottom. One thing I do want you to pay attention to is right in here. This is called the frieze sculpture. Let me zoom in on that. Notice how colorful this is. It's a misconception that because everything that we have from ancient Greek culture today is just bare stone, that's how they preferred it. But the Greeks were really all about lifelike detail, and that includes color. Let's see. If we look at what we have in the remains of this particular archer sculpture, originally it would have looked like this. It'd been a completely different sculpture. They've done analysis of the pigment that gets caught in the pores of the rock. They determined that not only was it colorful, but it had this like really elaborate pattern, and the colors are almost abrasively garish, just really, really strong. So walking through an Acropolis probably would have been a much more lively experience than you would have expected. A term to be noted here is a colonnade, Colonnade. A colonnade is a row of columns. And you see, the Parthenon is just made up of colonnades, also mentioned in the video. Another term, cella, 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 like cellar or cell, is just the primary space within a temple. This is going to apply not just to the Greek temples. A lot of these architectural elements are going to transfer into the Roman architecture as well. So you've got cella, just the main room, the primary utilitarian space, and a colonnade is just a row of columns. Any row of columns. There's a colonnade here, there's a colonnade here, there's a colonnade there. There's a lot of colonnades. So very quickly, a choros is just a generic male statue. It's not supposed to be a god. It's not supposed to be representative of any one specific person. In early Greek architecture, these were really common, almost like placeholders or something. Like if you had a nice garden somewhere, you might get a couple of Koro sculptures just placed around as a means of decorating, but they really didn't have a lot of value beyond that. The core is the female version of the Koros. Generic male, generic female. It's not supposed to be any one specific person. It's just a figure. Now, Greek sculpture started out pretty archaic. It was rough. They get a lot of detail in, but it's not very lifelike. And there is a very dramatic evolution. You see here that not only do they sculpt in marble, but this is a bronze foundry. I'm sorry. You can actually tell these body parts that are hanging on the wall. These are pieces of sculptures that are being assembled. You see here is one that was at one point in time assembled, and you can see where the joints were because some of them have fallen apart. Bronze sculptures were actually a lot lighter and a lot faster and easier to make than having to carve one out of marble. So it was a huge leap forward, but the leap forward that I'm more interested in is here. It's how naturalistic the stance of this particular figure is. This is Polykleitos. This is the spear bearer. I mentioned this in a video that I'll post below. Um, what you see here is called contrapposto, which means counterpose. Contrapposto. That is supposedly an observation that Polykleitos made when he was, really hanging out amongst the original Olympic athletes. And he noticed that when the athletes were in a state of repose, then they had one weight-bearing leg, so that's actually supporting the weight of their body, and one relaxed leg. And the counterpart of that is that across the bottom you have one tensed arm and one relaxed arm. So you've got tension here and repose here, tension here and repose here. So the tension sort of crosses the body, and you can see that a little bit in the torsion of the torso. There's a little bit of a twist there, and just for good effect, they usually tilt the head just a little bit. Now, you'll also see that these bars, sometimes you see these arms that have the bars that attach the arm to the hip just to keep the arm from breaking off, which happened a lot. Same thing with this random tree stump here is actually attached to the leg because when you start to institute contrapposto, then you really begin to put a lot of stress on these ankles, and those don't look like hugely weight-bearing ankles. So you had a lot of sculptures before they started instituting this that would really just collapse. So there's a progression toward this idealistic sense of beauty that I'll post in a video below that'll explain why they become so exaggerated in regards to their elongated proportions. Like you can even see here the difference between these two. Spear Bear is it's an athletic looking sculpture. This would have been far beyond the proportions of the average Greek citizen, but this at the time would have been basically godlike, and that's the only way it could have been perceived. The female version of that, also here. Now this is usually referred to as the Venus de Milo. Now what's interesting is that Greek classical sculpture builds toward this pursuit of beauty. And then we get to see these two, which would have been seen as just absolutely perfection. And then we transition to this, which is called Hellenistic. And Hellenistic is in pursuit of an emotional or psychological connection. It's something bigger than just pursuing beauty. It's really important.